There we are. The meeting is recorded, so we can start officially, I think. Karaites and Falashas, they were well known in Egypt and in the Sephardic world. Ashkenazim didn't really know too much. They knew about Karaites, but they weren't that familiar with them. Okay.
Hello?
And can we have people muting, please? The iPhone. Marcel, if that's the source of the noise. I'm not sure. I don't know who's here.
It was Yael. Yael.
Okay. So let me go back and say that Rav Ovadia Yosef spent time in Egypt. I don't know whether you know this, but though he was Jerusalem born, he did spend time as rabbi in Cairo, rabbi in Egypt. So he absorbed some of the Egyptian tradition, which, as we saw, is fairly easygoing. So the Radbaz and his student Rabbi Yaakov Castro were easygoing in relation to the Karaites and also in relation to the Jewish identity of the Falashas. They're descendants of the tribe of Dan. They are therefore Jews without any problem at all. Now, let's read what Rav Ovadia Yosef says in his famous Tuvah. Line 5. וכן ראיתי עלו בתשובה לגאון החסיד הרב הראשון לציון רבי רפאל מאיר פניג'ל זצ"ל. Now, Rav Ovadia Yosef, of course, is one of the few poskim, modern poskim, who command both the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi world of halakha. He was an expert in both, which is very rare, okay? Ashkenazim usually do their thing, Sephardim do their thing, but Rav Ovadia Yosef swam like a champion in both seas, the Ashkenazi Sea, the Sephardi Sea. So he cites a little-known Rishon LeZion, a Rabbi Raphael Panijal, born in the beginning of the 19th century, died in 1893. He was actually the Chacham Bashi of the Sephardi community in Jerusalem. He wrote Responsa Lashon Marpei, and Eliezer ben Yehuda mentions him in his memoirs, what it was like to be in Jerusalem at the time. He says he was a very impressive man, okay? He had this very official type residence and people came to him. But what did he say? Shisamech gam kan al Radbaz v'hamarikash, line 6, both Radbaz and Castro v'chatav. Umi avo achar shnei amlachim adirim ha'eleh. Who is going to come after these two kings, laharer shemetz pisul achar hayudim ha'eleh, to raise a doubt about the Jewishness of these Jews? V'lo yirana nafsho meliot nichve begachalatam. Now, not scared that he would be burned by their hot coals. Shekol divrehem kegachal ha'esh. All their words are like fiery embers. Umusadim al adnei ha'emet v'hatzedek v'chole. And then Rav Ovadia continues, "V'skimu lazeh bet din tzedek v'Yerushalayim b'rashut hagaon Rabbi Yosef Nisim Burla Zatzal." Again, he was a Sephardi authority, lived a little after Rabbi Panijal. He was famous both for his moderation. He was prepared to have Hebrew taught as a living language. You may remember that Eliezer ben Yehuda had an uphill fight with the Haredim in Yerushalayim in relation to teaching Hebrew as a living language, as a regular language, not a sacred one. But Chacham Burla was prepared to go along with him and prepared to support a school to teach Hebrew. And he was also a well-known Mekel. I told you, I think I mentioned the fact that the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi rabbi and the bus, the seat next to the woman, the Ashkenazi rabbi gets on the bus many years ago in Israel. The only spare seat is next to a woman. So he sees that that's the case and he stands, can't sit next to a woman. A few stops later on, the Sephardi gets on. Also, rabbi looks around, sees a seat, sits down, says hello to the woman and makes himself comfortable. As they're getting off, the driver turns to the Sephardi Rav and says, how come that your Ashkenazi rabbi didn't sit next to the woman you did? So the Sephardi Rav says they're very simple. He's a Rav, but I'm a Chacham. The Sephardim would call Chachamim. So he talks about the Chacham Burla. So that's really the difference, okay? And Rav Yosef is fascinating. We're going to talk about him at length when we get from the Middle Ages, from Rambam, and we still have a bit to do on Rambam. By the time we get to Avad Yosef, hopefully we'll all still be around. But he's very interesting indeed, okay? Hine kasher kihanti kerav Rashil Yisrael. And now Rav Yosef says, you know what? When I was chief rabbi, Heshafti l'sho'alai davar binyan hafalashim. In 1973, Taf Shin Lamed Gimel, I answered a question and I said, there's no doubt, and here I'm just going to translate freely, that the Falashim are descendants of the tribe of Dan, one of the 10 lost tribes, and there's no question about this. It's part of the halachic tradition. So when the Falasha leaders came to me and said they want to be united with the Jewish people in the state of Israel, and they're prepared to accept the Orthodox way, Torah shebichtav, Torah sheba'al peh, without any reservation, I said there's no problem, and we are going to accept them. And now look at the bold print, line 15. Rav Ovadia Yosef went to the government, he went to the Sochnut, he went to all the organizations in Israel and in the diaspora, and he went overboard to make sure that we would bring these falashas to Israel. The vilti yidach mimenu nidach, and not leave a single one behind. To educate them, of course, when they come here, but this psak din of mine caused the change, and therefore the government decided to change the law of return. And this happened in 1975, Tet Zayin Bishvat, and was agreed that there'd be a team, an inter-office team, to check this out. And in 1975, the Chok HaShvut, the law of return in Israel, was changed according to the opinion of the Rishon LeZion, Harav Ovadia Yosef, that the Chok HaShvut would now apply to falashas. Not a change. They said that the Chok HaShvut would now apply to falashas. No question that they were Jews. Wasn't a change. Oh, okay. What he says here is that, okay, we'll say very specifically in addition, okay, clarification. In the law of return, it applied to falashas. Line 21, Ha'etz HaMishpati LeMemshala. Who is Ha'etz HaMishpati LeMemshala? To my left, 1975, Aaron Barak. Ha'etz HaMishpati LeMemshala, Professor Aaron Barak, Horah. He gave instruction that the Ethiopian Jews would be Jews according to the Chok HaShvut, and they would be registered in the population registry as Jews. And in the light of those decisions, we brought to Israel between 84 and 85, 16,000 Ethiopian Olim, the first wave, okay? All this was almost single-handedly Rav Ovadia. Ulam, lo ekached, line 25. I will not hide the fact, ki ra'iti lagon Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog Zatzal. Now, Rabbi Dr. Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog wrote a letter in 1954, Tashshin Yudalet, to the Tarbut Toranit Lagola and Sochnut agency, that the falashas may not be Jewish because anthropologists maintain that looking at their customs and their language and their scripture, they are a group of Ethiopians who kind of underwent some sort of conversion, were attracted to some form of Judaism, but they're not Jewish by origin. And they invented this type of Judaism that has a scripture. They don't have Torah sheba'al peh, of course, they don't have Torah shebichtav, written in Amharic, okay, and that's their Sefer Torah. And therefore, what we have to do is we have to convert them. And so he wrote in 1955, okay, that we have to have a standard conversion procedure for the falashas, okay? And there has to be a kosher bet din, and the noraot nifleti. Now, line 33. Rav Yosef, who was around then, says, מה ראה ככה לדחות דברי גאוני עולם שקובעים בוועדות שאין ספק שהם משבט דן, מפני דבריהם של חוקרים שמטילים ספק ביהדותם? In the middle of line 34. What carries more halachic weight? Tradition that was supported by Radbaz and Rabbi Yaakov Castro and many eminent rabbis, including Panijal and Burla, or anthropologists, Goyim. Oh, except for Firkovich. The first one was Jewish, and he was the first scholar who went to Ethiopia, did a sociological study, and said, I'm not sure that they are really Jewish, okay? It's a legend, but I don't think it's true. Rabbi Dr. Yitzchak Eisner Levi Herzog was impressed by science, even though anthropology may not be science, same as physics. And he was prepared to go along with that, and he says, we have to have a proper giur. Now, Rav Ovadia was surprised then, okay? And he says, line 34, almost at the end. How can you prefer the anthropologists to Gaonei Olam? But then Rav Ovadia Yosef was fairly young, okay, 1954, 1955, and he wasn't prepared to take on Rabbi Herzog. He says that when I saw that Herzog told Rabbi Natan Salem, who was the secretary of the Rabbanut at the time, that we're going to make a Giur L'Chumra, and only scores arrived in the 50s, okay, flashes. And they didn't object. לא רציתי לחלוק למעשה על הגאון רב יצחק אייזנר לוי הרצוג הנ"ל. So I did not want to take on Rabbi Herzog, and out of deference and respect, I didn't stir. אולם לדינה לא כן אנוכי עמדי, but that's not my view of the din. ודעתי שיש לסמוך על הפוסקים הנ"ל, שהפלשים יהודים לכל דבר ואינם צריכים גיור אפילו לחומרה. Now, a tougher nut to crack was the Tzitz Eliezer, okay? Rabbi Waldenberg, who also cites the Radbaz, but he says, I'm not sure that they are Jewish again because of the Chokrim. Vihine, and now line 1 on page 2. Hevi gam ken b'shem shvilei olam la Rav Shimshon Bloch HaLevi. What does the phrase shvilei olam mean? Translated into English. Shvilei olam. Anybody?
The way of the world.
A way, well, no, shvil is not a way, really, path. The paths of the world. What do you think the subject of this book is by Rabbi Shimshon Bloch HaLevi? Geography, okay? Now, remember, Bloch HaLevi was a Galician rabbi, the 18th and mid-19th century. Jews in Europe are awakening to the fact that they're pretty backward in anything except for Torah, science, geography, languages, and this is the great age, the late 1700s, of Jews leaving the ghetto and thirsting for what they call chokhmah. Mendelssohn is the famous example. Solomon Maimon is famous because of the autobiography he left, but Jews are thirsting for chokhmah. So what rabbis did, and many of them were educated, was they wrote in Hebrew handbooks for all sorts of things, medicine, physics, astronomy, and geography. So this Galician rabbi writes a book in Hebrew on geography, and he gets haskamot by the Khatam Sofer. That's pretty good. The Khatam Sofer gave a haskama, agreed to the book being published, then he must have thought it was perfectly kosher. Rabbi Mordechai Banet, the famous rabbi of Nikolsburg, also no mean machmir, and Elazar Fleckless, who was a student of the Nodab Yehuda, who became the chief rabbi of Bohemia. So they all wrote Haskamot, and it became a very popular book. Thousands of copies were sold. It was translated into Ladino, and Bloch also cites the Chokrim, when he talks about Ethiopia, says there are Jews there or people who claim that they're Jewish, but actually they're not, okay? So Ashkenazim were influenced by books such as the Shvilei Olam, and they didn't have the tradition of the Radbaz and the Rabbi Castro, and they never knew Falashas. Egyptian Jews encounter Falashas all the time. They're there just to the south, Egypt, and then Abyssinia, Ethiopia. But in Poland, Russia, Lithuania, you never saw a black man, never mind a Falasha, and a black Jew was probably like a fantasy, okay? Like a pink elephant. So it was very difficult for them to swallow that. So that, of course, isn't what Avad Yosef would dare to say publicly, but it may underlie this whole debate as to whether the Falashas are generally Jewish or not. Okay, Vim Ken. בנידון דדן שלא הייתה כאן עדות ברורה ואי אפשר שתהיה עדות כזאת, Rav Avad Yosef says we cannot rely upon these scientists at all. Bloch is only, again, copying from what the anthropologist wrote, and he's impugning an entire congregation of Israel who suffered persecution for their Jewishness on the basis of these anthropologists when respectable Sephardi rabbis, okay, Radbaz, Castro, Panijan, and Bura, but they didn't cut much ice, apparently in Galicia. V'gam ma shevi b'tzitz Eliezer, and now I'm going to cite line 5 from the Otsar Yisrael. Anybody know what Otsar Yisrael is, or have you used it? Anybody here? Otsar Yisrael.
Isn't it the treasury?
You're translating. You think it's to do with money, do you, Shmuley?
Well, isn't everything? That's what all this debate was about. It's all about politics. It's not halacha.
I said money, okay. Otsar, though, is a treasury, but it's a literary treasury. Now, David Eisenstein, Yehuda Eisenstein, very famously, Yehuda David Eisenstein, 20th century, okay, went from Lithuania to New York, did a lot of publishing in Hebrew, and published Otsar Yisrael, which is more traditional than the English Jewish encyclopedia that had been published earlier. So he's more traditional, but again, his ideas are fairly academic. They say that the Satmar Rebbe kept a copy, but at the back of his bookshelf, so you'd never see it. In other words, he had a hidden shelf or two, the back of the bookcase, and then he had all these sort of semi-heretical works in Otsar Yisrael. He had the whole set there. But Otsar Yisrael, who's more traditional than Jewish encyclopedia, also says שבעיני רבים מחוקרי זמננו הפלשים יושב ארץ כוש אינם מעדת ישראל. They are not genuine Jews. They converted in some semi-Christian, semi-Jewish fashion sometime that we don't know when, and that's how they became the Falashas. וליבם נוטה לחושבם מכיתות הנוצרים המתקרבים לדת ישראל. All sorts of Christians who are close to Judaism, Seventh-day Adventists, okay? There are the Noachides in Lubbock, Texas, okay? Whole community of Noachides, all sorts of Christians who have these sort of black Hebrews of Dimona, okay? They're Christians. So something happened in Ethiopia, a similar type, and you get these hybrid Jews and Christians. That's the view in the Otsar Yisrael. Noraot nifleiti shemistamech al sefer zeh. And of course, Rabbi Avad Yosef says, how can you rely upon such a book which has words of heresy in? He has to add that, sheyesh bo kama divrei minu. Neged edut gaonei Yisrael. Gam aluva isa shenachtoma meid alea. Nice phrase. Actually, Otsar Yisrael points out at the end of his discussion that all of the descriptions of the, most of the descriptions of the Falashas were by non-Jewish anthropologists who never really penetrated Falasha society. So all they got was their view as scientists coming along and investigating from the outside. There's a very famous story about anthropology that Margaret Mead went to Samoa to investigate the Pacific Islanders, and she was taking notes and asking them questions. And her view was that in the light of their answers, they didn't know about the connection between the sex act and producing children. And when this was published, a lot of people laughed, and it turned out that she simply had never, I'm going to use the word penetrated Samoan society sufficiently well to realize that they were actually pulling her leg. And what we call this in sociological terms is that when you do a study of a group of people, you have to have what we call inner understanding, verstehen, okay? You have to really get into them and understand their codes and the way they speak and understand how they relate to strangers who may be seen as being very obtrusive. So they pretended to be very obtuse, but actually they knew very well about the relationship between these two things. So Ovad Yosef, although he hadn't read Margaret Mead or about her, he says something very similar. He says, how can you reply upon that when we're talking about Geonei Olam? Then he makes a couple more points. First of all, he says that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein also weighed in on the act, and he wrote to his son, Rabbi Moshe Tendler, in 1984, and even though the Radbaz had said that they may be Jews, okay, halachically, it's not that clear. Perhaps the Radbaz didn't know historically about the Falashas or where they came from, and perhaps they've changed today, and therefore it's best that we do a Giur L'Chumra, okay? Now, then he goes on to say that we don't need to worry about the Kiddushin or the Mamzerim, because according to Rav Ovadia, they were always Jewish, so they always married other Jews, and they always married within their community, and they divorced within their community. And since they're all psulei edut, and they have no Giur at all, there's no problem. There's no problem because they were never halakhically married, never halakhically divorced, so it's easy, okay? They're Jewish, and there's no problem about their status because they could never create mamzerim because they never had marriage or divorce. You might say kiddushay bi'ah, okay? We know that according to the Gemara, if a Jewish man jumps into bed with a Jewish woman whom he is allowed to marry, we assume that the purpose is marriage. Why? Ein Adam oseh bilato bilat znut, as you'll see on line 24. Chazaka ein Adam oseh bilato bilat znut. And a Jewish man would never dream of jumping into bed with a Jewish woman unless he planned to marry and wanted that to be an act of kiddushin. Well, that's in the Gemara. Times may have changed, but even in the Gemara, the case to which that principle is appended, and you always have to go back to the case, is the case of a divorced couple. They were divorced, but they're witnesses that they spent the night together in a holiday inn. Well, okay, it's called a pundak, whatever it was, okay? Now, the Gemara says we assume that they plan to remarry because it's a mitzvah for the garush to take the grusha back, unless, of course, he's married someone else in between. Secondly, the garusha and the grusha are used to sleeping with each other, so it wouldn't have been difficult, okay? Now, the question is, why do we apply this, why do we apply the rule of Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilat Znut? According to the Rambam, it's clear that we're talking about a very specific case. According to the Ramah, in Poland, Catholic Poland, any type of sexual intercourse could be interpreted as an act of marriage because he comes from a much more sexually conservative society. But in any case, says Rav Ovad Yosef, if you want to have kiddushay biyah, you have to have an indication that the couple desires a halachic marriage, okay? The best way of doing that is to appoint two witnesses to stand outside the bedroom, and as the couple enters to say, for the guy to say to the woman, Harei at mukudeshet li b'biyah zo. We're going to be married halachically with this biyah, okay? You don't have to have the Wadim standing there and looking, because that would be embarrassing. So they stand, we say, a day yichud, a day biyah. They have seen the couple secluded for long enough, and as it takes, the Gemara tells us how long it is. The time it takes to fry a certain fish is enough time that you need. And okay, but you have to have a positive indication. The Falashas don't know about halachic marriage. They don't know about halachic divorce. So nothing that they do has anything to do with Kiddushei Biyah. And therefore, Lifikach. Now, line 28, last word. Ein lachush lekiddushin klal. No kiddushin there. Baha salikna uvaha nachitna. We have flown and we've landed. There's no question of their kosher status, no mamzerut, perfectly kosher, perfectly Jewish, and that's why today, to this day, Rav Ovadia, Sephardic rabbis, very lenient. You want to marry an Ethiopian Jew? No worries. Go ahead. You don't need anything. ומותרים לבוא בקהל ישראל ללא שום גיור אפילו לחומרה. No גיור even לחומרה. והשם יתברך יצילנו משגיאות. May the Lord save us from errors. ומתורתו יראינו נפלאות, and show us wonders from his Torah. ויאיר עינינו במאור תורתנו הקדושה. Amen. Okay. But do all the Ashkenazim agree? What do you think? No, they don't. So the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Waldenberg, leads the anti-Falasha camp and says, without Giur, we're not going to marry into them. Okay? So why? He says, you know what? There's a chashash. Because whilst they don't have Kiddushin and Gittin as far as we know, there may have been a time when they did. And then you could create mamzerim. So the best thing to do is to make them non-Jews. If they're non-Jews, there can never be a question of mamzerut at all. They don't know about Yibum, they don't know about certain arayot, okay? Umisafek goyim hagam ken lo yatsu, and they may not be Jews. Al kol panim, okay? Yesh lahachil alehem efo kechola shekatavti mibchina zot bekuntusi ala karayim. We treat them as Karaites. Don't marry, okay, and they're suspect, okay, unless they go through whatever they need to go through. The Gam Rabot, go and look at what he wrote about the Bnei Israel. We're not going to go into them, the Bnei Israel community from India. So the best course to be safe, make them non-Jews. If you make them non-Jews, then there's no issues of mamzerut, no issues of arayot, no issue of yibum and chalitza, and then we just convert them and they become Jews. Okay? Now, I also consulted with my good friend, Arav Agaon Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss. I'm on the top of page 3, line 1, Ubeit Dino. Now, by this time, Rav Weiss had left Manchester Shmuley, and he was here in Jerusalem, the head of the Eidah HaCharedis. Okay? Very from. And he agreed with me, and this is the Das Torah, which was published in Ha'edah. Okay? Now, line 2, Mitam, Kevod Kedushato Maran HaGaonav Betin Shlita, Varabanim HaGaonim HaBetin Sedek Shlita, Venogea LaFalashim She'eviu Artza Meretz Chabash, דעתנו על פי דעת תורתנו הקדושה, הנה פשיטה שהם צריכים כל אחד ואחד בפרטיות גירות גמורה בקבלת עול מצוות והטפת דם ברית, כדת וכדין וטבילה במקווה. The whole hog, you have to do an entire גיור process. Okay? כדי להוציא מחשש גויות, so that they're no longer גויים. אבל בנוגע לעניין יוחסין עדיין יש לחוש, כמו שכתב הרלב"ז, then Moshe Aryeh Frein. And even if they do that, perhaps somewhere along the line there was a mamzer, so we're not going to marry them anyhow. Moshe Aryeh Freund, okay, Yisrael Moshe, okay, Ben Gaon HaKadosh Duchinsky, Yisrael Yaakov Fisher, Binyamin Rabinovich, Avram David Horowitz, and to cap it all, Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss Rav Av Bedin Po'ir Kodesh Tibanev Tikonen. So Rav Alderberg says, well, as far as I'm concerned, we are not going to accept the Falashes unless they undergo Giyur. And I have the Eidah Haredis on my side. And that's where we stand more or less today. And if you look at the last line 14, V'kach Pirsum HaGaonim HaGaon Rav Eliezer Man Shach. Anybody remember him, Rav Shach? V'Gaon Rabbi Yosef Shalom Eliashiv. V'Goyen Reb Shleimer Zalman Oyabach Shlita. ואתם עמם ואיתם עוד כמה גדולים, ובזה הלשון. הננו בזאת להודיע כי על פי ההלכה כפי שנהגו בארצנו הקדושה מאז ומתמיד. מאז ומתמיד forever doesn't include Rav Panijal or Burla, all the Sephardim rabbis who were here long before the Ashkenazim came from Poland and Galicia, the new wave, okay? הפלאשים הבאים מאתיופיה אינם בכלל ספק יהודים וצריכים לעבור גיור כדין, היינו קבלת מצוות, הטפת דם ברית וטבילה, ואין לאף אחד לשנות את הדבר עד כאן לשונו. So to this day, legally speaking, according to the law of return and the law of the population registry, Ethiopians are Jews. Rabbis of the Sephardic ilk generally will marry Jews to Ethiopians without any process of conversion. Ashkenazim not only insist that they convert to be recognized as Jews, will probably not intermarry with them. And I leave you to wonder about what may account for this split along Sephardi and Ashkenazi lines. Derry who? That's right. I did indeed. I actually did a wedding between an Israeli Jew and an Ethiopian girl. Debbie has just informed me. They went to the right Rabbanut and they got their documents. There was no problem, okay? So, Torah Karaites, Falashes, all of this, of course, was because of the Rambam. Now we're going to start a fascinating discussion of Maimonides' letter on apostasy, okay? Igeret Hashmad, also known as Igeret Kiddush Hashem. So, let's begin. So, Shmuley, you're my first reader in view. So, background.
The letter on apostasy, Igeret Hashmad, was written by Maimonides in 1160 or 61, at least 7 years before the completion of his first major work, Commentary on the Mishnah, in 1168. He was approximately 26 years old when he wrote this famous letter in Arabic.
Now, Shmad, of course, means you stop being Jewish and you go over to a non-Jewish religion, okay? That's Shmad. Now, okay, in it,
he not only demonstrates his unique qualities of clarity of thought, searching analysis, skillful application of sources and scientific method, but he also emerges as a dynamic champion of his people.
Now, Igeret Hashmad is a tshuva. It's a responsa to a particular situation. Rambam is not in his role as codifier of Jewish law, because we'll read what he writes in his code later on. He's not a philosopher. He's not rigorous logic. He's heart, emotion, empathy, and sympathy. And that's what makes the Responsa literature such a wonderful thing to read. So another line or two, please, Shmuley. Consummate
scholarship and statesmanship unite in a brilliant effort to provide his persecuted co-religionists with inspiration and hope in a dark and tragic time.
So we're talking about a dark and tragic time, okay? And Jack, are you up to read? Can you unmute? Unmute.
I'm
Great.
sorry, I have to decline today because I can't read this on this computer. My computer is out.
Sorry to hear that. Thank you for letting us know. Fabia, are you there? You
yes.
are.
Yes, I am.
Can you please
Yes.
read from line 27, the last word, from?
From the middle of the 12th century, the Jews of Morocco and Spain were subject to a wave of religious persecution by the new Muslim sect of the Almohades.
The Almohades.
Almohades, the unifiers of the divine name.
You can see the word yichud actually, Al-Muhadim.
Right.
Had, one is there.
Yeah.
They were very pure Muslims who unified God. God is entirely abstract and nothing physical is to be attributed to him, which in Maimonides' eyes makes Islam not idolatry. It's not a form of idolatry because it's got a very pure monotheism. Now, not everybody agreed with Maimonides on this, but he knew Islam very well, and his belief, which we'll read in the Tshuva he sent to Rav Ovadia Tzedek of Baghdad, was that Islam is not idolatry. Christianity may very well be because of the Trinity, but Islam definitely not. And the Almohades were absolutely uncompromising in their rejection of anything physical. God is alone, unique, nothing like him, okay? So it's close to the Maimonidean approach to Judaism. But there were nasty things about the Almohades. Now, read on, please, Fabia, the founder of the sect.
The founder of the sect was the Shiite Abdullah ibn Tumat, 1080 to 1130, a follower of the mystical philosopher Al-Ghazali, and a believer in the sole authority of the Quran.
So we know you got to split between Sharia, between Shiite and Sunni. Well, one of the major differences between the two is that the Shiites say only the text of the Quran is authoritative. The Sunnis say the Hadith, the traditions of the Prophet, if you like, a Torah Shabbat Peh, is as authoritative as the Quran. So the Shiites are far more extreme because they are not able to leaven the text of the Quran with interpretation and adjustment. So Sunnis are milder, Shiites are always more extreme. It's a bit like Protestants and Catholics. Protestants under Martin Luther said sola scriptum, only follow what's in the Bible. Some of them have turned out to be very extreme, okay? Whereas the Catholics have this commentary in canon law. But Shiites and Sunnis split mainly along these lines, okay? And of course, interpretation is accommodation. Whereas the Almohades were extremists, and therefore he conceived, Fabia, he conceived an Islam
dedicated to the Quran and the sword.
Because the sword is part of the Quran, okay? To make the rest of the world, by force if necessary, into, and no excuses, no ability to tolerate any world that doesn't become subject to Islam. And you can see that today. There are Shiite states that are constantly trying to take over the world, okay? Because this is what they need to do. All right. But not only was he dedicated to the Quran and the sword, but as a religious ascetic. Fabia, a little more, please.
He was anxious to combat luxury in living and dress, and was against poetry, music, and art, which had been warmly supported by the previous Muslim rulers of the Sunni Almoravid dynasty.
Now, things are always changing in the Middle East. The Almoravids were very nice. They were very interested in living nicely in art, poetry, music, much less extreme. They were Sunni, not Shiite, and they were tolerant. But as soon as the Almohades came on the scene, and this, of course, is, we said, in the middle of the 12th century, which is when Maimonides was growing up in Cordoba, things changed overnight. Suddenly it becomes a very dangerous world. Marcel, are you there?
I am indeed.
Okay, so thank you. Can you please read from line 32? Thank you, Fabia. As a religious ascetic.
As a religious ascetic, he was anxious to combat luxury in living and dress, and was against poetry, music, and art, which have been warmly supported by the previous Muslim rulers of the Sunni Almoravid dynasty. The Sunnis accepted the Hadith traditions as well as the Quran. Ibn Tumat also strongly opposed tolerance towards infidels, Jews and Christians, which have been a hallmark of Almoravid rule, and advocated their forced conversion.
In other words, under the Almoravids, who were the rulers, Muslim rulers of Spain, things were fine. Jews did well. There was tolerance, appreciation of their ability to contribute to philosophy and to poetry, Yehuda Levi and Samuel ibn Gabirol, and music. In other words, it was like many societies we were used to living in, those of us who are older, where Jews seemed to be perfect part of the landscape. But the Almohadis came in and all of that changed. So, in Islam,
conversion is effected by the convert uttering the Shahada, I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah.
So conversion in Islam is very easy. All you have to do is say the Shahada, okay? Now, let's have another line or two. Ibn Tumat's vision.
Ibn Tumat's vision of the worldwide Islamic dominion ruled by the sword and Mohammedan law was put into practice by his disciple Abd al-Mu'min.
Mu'min, not to be confused with the Mu'mins, okay? This is a different type of Mu'min who became known as
the Emir
Murnasenin, Prince of the Faithful.
The
dynasty.
The dynasty of the Almoravids was uprooted after a prolonged siege in 1146 when Morocco fell into Abd al-Mumin's hands.
So the Almohadis came out of the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. They went west, they conquered Morocco, the city of Morocco fell, the Almoravids were finished, and now the Almohadis are in power. Now, Shmuley, we're back to you, please. For Jews and Christians.
For Jews and Christians, the only alternatives were death or apostasy.
According to Ibn Tumart and his students, according to the Almohadi view of the world, you can only do two things. You become a Muslim or you die by the sword, preferably head chopped off. Okay? Now, in 1146.
In 46, he called together the heads. Oh, there were only the heads of the Jewish community left because they beheaded them.
Exactly, Shmuley, I was waiting for you to say so.
And informed them as follows. Your ancestors have not accepted Muhammad as the true prophet on the ground that your Messiah will appear 500 years after the Hijra, the advent of Muhammad.
Where he got this from, nobody knows, okay? But this was what he said.
The 500 years have now elapsed and your Messiah has not appeared. Consequently, unless you will accept Muhammad as your prophet, we shall regard you as heretics and outcasts, forbidden to dwell in our land. Should you decide to remain here, you have only one of two choices, either embrace Islam or death.
Okay. So, Fabia, back to you, please. Subsequently,
after some persuasion, he agreed to give the Jews and Christians a third alternative, namely to leave the country.
Don't say that he was not flexible. He was indeed.
Can I just ask, so this idea of dimitude, it was only in Sunni lands, was it?
The status of the dhimmi is a Sunni idea, exactly.
Right, okay.
Sunnis were prepared to accommodate and to tolerate. So under the rule of Omar, as you will no doubt remember, you could be a dhimmi. In other words, you could pay a special tax. When a Muslim walked along the street, you had to make way. You could never ride a horse. Only a Muslim could ride a horse. Never build a synagogue or a church higher than a mosque, and be humiliated and told to do this, that, and the other. In some places wear special clothes and a special hat. But that was only in Sunni lands. The Shiites will have none of that, at least under the Almohadi version, which was extreme. So, flexibility though, even the Shiites gave the Jews a chance. Flee. Now,
many of the Christians were able to find an asylum in northern Spain among their co-religionists, who opened the doors for their
Now
persecuted
remember,
brethren.
in Catalonia, Barcelona, northern Spain, the Reconquista had already begun. In other words, the Christians were now advancing south and defeating the Muslims. Okay, it will be a while before the Muslim power is broken in Spain, but at least northern Spain, okay, is providing a Christian refuge for Christians fleeing Morocco and southern Spain from the Almohades. But the Jews, as usual,
Had no such hospitable refuge open to
Oh.
them. Many suffered
from the frying pan into the fire.
Many suffered martyrdom, some were able to emigrate, but the majority went through the motions of apostasy and uttered the Islamic formula of conversion without any internal commitment.
Okay, so this was happening in the early 12th century, okay, when Maimonides was growing up in Cordoba, all right, and took place in Morocco first and then in Spain. And in Morocco, on some occasions, Fabia,
On some occasions, they attended the mosque. Secretly, however, they practiced the Jewish rites.
so this is in the Muslim world, long before we usually think of this Marano's Inquisition, the Christian world. No, this was in the Muslim world, okay, in the 12th century, but it was clearly less intense than the Inquisition. The Muslims did not enforce in the same way that the Christians did or were to do later on. What they did was they wanted you to say the Shahada, and there was questions whether they wanted the new Muslims to wear special clothes or not. But what was very clear, if you look at the documents from the time, the Muslims, the old-time Muslims, looked at all these Jews who said the Shahada and then pretended to be Muslims and did well. They were successful in the professions, in the business, and they even became Muslim preachers. And they got angry and they said, these jumped up Muslims, they're really Jews and they're doing better than us. We better persecute them a bit. But they were never as efficient as the Christians were. And they never really rooted out Jews who were in the secrecy of their home doing mitzvot and following Jewish practices. So secretly, however, they practiced the Jewish rites. And this is the phenomenon that Maimonides addresses, okay, in 1148.
The year of Maimonides' bar mitzvah, the Almohades invaded Spain and conquered most of the country, including the city of Cordova.
Cordoba, please.
Cordova.
Okay, we have the English Cordova, but it's actually Cordoba, which had been a haven, which had been a place where Jews, Christian, and Muslims would meet and discuss philosophy and culture and theology. The Andalusia that Maimonides always yearned for after the exile from Spain. And his family was now on the run. And we talked about this when we talked about Maimonides in the past and the Guide for the Perplexed. We don't know what happened in those years between 1148 and 1159 when they turned up in Fez. Okay, it's almost 10 years. And presumably the family was on the run. The Maimon family
was forced into a life of wandering and spent the next 11 years in various parts of the Iberian Peninsula.
And there are some historians who want to say that the Maimon family also said the Shahada, okay, in order to save their lives. But they continued practicing their Judaism. Maimonides was writing his commentary on the Mishnah. He was learning Torah, as he says, during all those years. Okay? Now, Marcel, please,
Right.
1159.
1159, family settled in Fez, where conditions have become somewhat milder than in Muslim Spain.
In other words, Fez, where the whole thing started in Morocco, is now milder. Or according to some historians, if you were a Spaniard and you came to Fez, you weren't treated as harshly as if you were a native Moroccan. Whatever the case may be, the Maimon family surfaces in Fez, and also Rabbi Maimon.
Also, Rabbi Maimon wanted his sons, Moses and David, to study with Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen ibn Sosan, who was recognized as a successor of Rabbi Joseph ibn Migas.
Now, the Rimigash was Rabbi, not the Ribash, the Rimigash. Yeah, okay, the Rimigash.
Rabbi Maimon's teacher
Was the Rosh Yeshiva, the teacher of the Dayan, Maimonides' father, and Maimonides himself says that, as far as he's concerned, the Rimigash was the best, okay? So his student was now in Fez. So Maimon, who was a student of the Rimigash, brings his sons to learn with this Rabbi Yehuda Cohen ibn Sosan, by the way, a few years later, was martyred. The authorities said, you have to become a Muslim. He refused and was put to death. Now, Rabbi Maimon's teacher in Spain, in 1160,
Rabbi Maimon wrote a letter of consolation, Igeret Nechama, in which he exhorted his fellow Jews not to despair, for God had not forsaken them. The letter was full of warmth and emotion, and was designed to act as a balm for their wounded spirits.
In other words, the father of Maimonides, the Dayan Rabbi Maimon, wrote something called the Igeret Nechama, a letter of consolation, to his brethren who are suffering under Almohadi rule, who are leading double lives. They've said the Shahada, they attend the mosque from time to time, okay, but they keep everything that they can in secret. And Rabbi Maimon wrote a letter to support them, to say, it's a terrible thing, we'd much rather not have to do this, but don't worry, if you've done it, you'll be okay, all right? It's a short letter, I haven't brought it unless you really want to see the text, but it was just a nice, fuzzy, sort of warm letter saying, don't give up hope, everything will eventually become a little bit better. There was, however, and this is where things get interesting, and this is where we come into the picture with Igeret HaShmad. Okay, Marcel, 26. There was, however,
a zealous Jew residing in Fez who was not pleased with the lenient tone of Rabbi Maimon's letter, and who decided to inquire, in Maimonides' words, of a foreign rabbi who had never experienced the ravages of Al-Mahdi rule, to render a halachic decision on the permissibility of choosing a bogus conversion to Islam rather than opting for a martyr's death.
So we're going to unpack this a bit more, but I want to emphasize the bogus nature of the conversion. Both Jews and non-Jews realized that the Jews were saying the Shahada without any sincerity, okay? And this is an important fact in Maimonides' Tshuva, in his Igeret HaShmad. But what happened was that there was a Jew in Fez who says, I don't like this. Actually, nobody should say the Shahada. According to Halacha, you should rather die. And what he did was he wrote to a rabbi a long way away. We don't know who the rabbi was. We don't even have the reply of the rabbi until much later when Abraham Geiger discovered a manuscript with this actual letter from the foreign rabbi. But he was far away from the experience of the Jews who were being persecuted under the Almohadis. So the question goes to the rabbi, is it permitted for Jews to say the Shahada? And is that not idolatry? Are they not then rather to choose death? And is there any value in the mitzvot they do when they lead this double life? Okay, line 30. Let's go back to Shmuley. Thank you, Marcel. The reply of this anonymous authority. Unmute Shmuley.
Yeah. The reply of this anonymous authority to the inquiry is quick, uncompromisingly harsh, and diametrically opposed to Maimon's letter of consolation. He declared that any Jew who publicly uttered the Muslim confession, although secretly performing all of Jewish precepts, could no longer be regarded as a Jew. The Muslims were idolaters.
And of course, Maimonides disagrees. Okay, his view is that Muslims, as opposed to Christians, are not idolaters.
And the only course for a steadfast Jew was not to submit to compulsion in any form, but to accept martyrdom. This responsa was widely circulated amongst the northwestern African Jews, and one can well imagine the panic and consternation it provoked.
Northwest Africa includes Libya, Algeria,
Algeria,
Morocco, the whole.
Chad.
Thank you, and Timbuktu as well. Yes.
It was as if they were cast forth once again into the desert, the Sahara of despair. Some felt completely crushed under a burden of guilt to the extent that they were prepared to completely embrace Islam, since they were in any case regarded as apostates and outcasts.
This is the effect that this tshuva had when it was publicized amongst the Jews of Morocco. Wow, halachic psak, what we've done is against halakha. We are regarded as idolaters, no value in any of the mitzvot we do. So some said, well, why not then go, as it were, I can't say this of Islam, the whole hog, and just become Muslims and forget that we were ever Jewish at all. In other words, this had an ongoing effect. Did the rabbi, the foreign rabbi, think about that when he wrote his halachic psak? Okay, so that's an interesting point here. Now, the young Maimonides
was outraged by the intolerance and harsh judgment of this unengaged, obtuse, and hasty critic.
Those are my words, okay? Unengaged, obtuse, and hasty. In other words, when talking about real Piskei Halacha in real life for a huge Jewish community, don't you need to think twice before you put down very quickly an uncompromising answer of this sort and tell this whole group that they're not worth any Jewish salt at all? Is this really the right thing to do? And as if
associating himself personally in the charge, he proceeds in the Igeret Hashmad to combat the zealot on two main fronts, the first Agadic and the second Halachic.
So what we're going to do is we are going to unpack the Agadah and the Halacha that Rambam skillfully uses to defend those who said the Shahada to save their lives. You'll also, of course, see that what he does say is that if you have a chance, leave. Leave, leave. Don't say, I have property here, my children are here. It's not so easy to leave. You've got to leave. But as long as you are there, you should keep on doing mitzvot. And we'll see it's a very sophisticated effort, okay? And really shows a side to Maimonides we've never seen. We know him as the consummate codifier, the consummate theologian, philosopher. We don't know him as a leader of his people who's full of sympathy and empathy at a time when the need is great. Now, what we have next is simply a little biographical detail I've added. So, Fabian, would you give us this, please, if you can unmute? And then the original Arabic text.
The original Arabic text of Igeret Hashmad was lost. It was translated into Hebrew by an unknown translator and printed for the first time by Abraham Geiger in 1850 from a Munich manuscript.
Geiger did a whole lot of, it was only in the 19th century, in fact, that many of the medieval works that we have today were actually made available in print. They were in libraries all over Europe, in Russia too, especially. There are also manuscripts in the Bodleian, as there are to this day. As we'll see, the Chemda Gnuza was copied by Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Edelman in the Bodleian Library, okay? So for years and years, these manuscripts, handwritten, were there, but nobody published them, and very few people had access. The 19th century was a flowering of Jewish manuscripts, and when the Geniza was discovered in Cairo, as we have already learned, the whole thing exploded. So it's only really since the 19th century that we've had the rich Jewish literature that we take for granted today. Another printing appeared
in 1856 in Königsberg by Tzvi Hirsch Edelman in his work Hemda Gnuza, taken from a manuscript in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. A third edition appeared in Leipzig in 1860 by A. Lichtberg in his Kovetz Tshuvot Harambam ve'Igrotav. In the last edition, the letter was entitled Ma'amer Kiddush Hashem. Ma'amar.
My mistake. Ma'amar Kiddush Hashem.
Kiddush Hashem.
Rather the letter or the article on sanctifying God than Igeret Hashmad. But it's commonly known as Igeret Hashmad. So I'm going to stop the share because we come, I think, time-wise to the end. And what we're going to do next time is to unpack Maimonides' very skillful attempt to justify what tens of thousands of his co-religionists and possibly his own family did in order to survive. Now, if I was to say to you, and you hadn't heard this introduction, if a Jew was to utter the Shahada, do you think that would be halachically okay, or do you think he should have died rather than do that? You may be forgiven for saying you should rather die, Kiddush Hashem, right? That may be what your reaction, if you're not in the situation, would be. And for most of us today, fortunately, that's not the situation. But I'm just going to remind you that in Budapest, during the Shoah, there was an opportunity for many Jews to obtain forged documents that said that they were not Jews. And they were asked by the Hungarians to make a declaration to that effect. I'm not Jewish, I believe, I'm a Christian, I believe whatever I believe. And they did so. And the rabbis who gave them permission were all Orthodox rabbis who based themselves upon Igeret Hashmad. So it's not as simple, of course, as it sounds. Rambam is going to tell us that Islam is not idolatry. He's going to tell us that if you are compelled on the pain of death to do something which looks like idolatry, although it's not, and if it's not a concrete act, but only a phrase or a word, and if that word is not meant sincerely, and if the non-Jews were forcing you to say that word, know that you're not taking it seriously, all of that could very well count as permission to say the Shahada to save your life. So there are all sorts of aspects of this particular situation that Maimonides is able to marshal. He also talks about the fact that you have to be very careful when you hastily write down a reply which is meant to be halakha, but takes no account of the situation in which the receivers of your tshuva live. And also he talks about the fact that Jewish leaders who are not sympathetic with their communities who are under threat and who perhaps not willingly, but are actually engaged in a lot of things that are not halachic. The correct attitude is not to cancel, but to accept. And he'll bring us agadot about Moshe Rabbeinu, about Eliyahu Hanavi, the prophet Isaiah, even about an angel, to create a model of what the appropriate Jewish leader should be doing in this type of situation. So all this awaits us next week. Same time, same place. Shmuley.
Yes, sir.
You want to say something?
No. I was saying
Get your hand
goodbye.
up.
I was saying goodbye.
Just say the royal goodbye, okay? The Queen and all, the late Queen, okay. So everybody have a good rest of week, Besorot Tovot all around, and looking forward to getting into the nitty-gritty of the Igeret Hashmad and Rambam as a Meshiv, as a very humane responder next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye,
so
everybody.
much.
Erev Tov.
Erev Tov.
Erev Tov.
Bye.